Thank you very much, Gaynor, and thank you all for coming. And it's good to see so many friendly faces. It's a special occasion for me, as Gaynor said, and I'm very pleased to have my family here to support me tonight. My mother's here, my partner Peter is here, and my sister Linda, who have all played a major role in my journey to this place. One person who would have loved to have been here tonight is my father. He's sadly no longer with us, but this lecture's dedicated to him. So I'm addressing this question tonight about clay. What kind of stuff do you call that? You might have noticed that the question has something of a facetious tone to it, but it's also a serious question. And I hope that during the course of my lecture, the reason for posing the question in this kind of way will become clear. There are two key words there. The first, of course, being clay. But before I talk about clay, there's something else I have to talk about first, which is to look at this other key word, the strange word, stuff. I'm sure that I'm not telling you anything that you didn't already realize when I say that increasingly, it seems, we are surrounded by more and more stuff. To some extent, this has always been true. Human beings have always shared their world with other things, and we continue to do so. If we just pause and think for a moment, we can remind ourselves that we are wearing clothes made of different kinds of cloth. We are sitting on seats made from wood, textiles, plastic, or whatever. Most of us came here tonight either in or on some kind of metal vehicle. Or we walked here wearing leather shoes. And I could go on. And even though so many of us spend so much time now looking at screens and inhabiting the virtual world of computers and digital technology, we still can't avoid the world of materials and objects, the world of things and stuff. All the time we are literally brushing up against that world. Indeed, the sheer amount of the stuff that we are brushing up against seems to be growing all the time. It's not only the amount of stuff that's growing, the sheer variety of stuff in the world is increasing. There's a whole range of new man-made materials, and although we might not have encountered most of them so far, the chances are that we will do so soon. Some of you, I'm sure, will be aware of graphene, revolutionary material that's strong, flexible, transparent, and conductive, and almost unbelievably is just one atom thick. I wonder how many of you have heard of shrilk, which we see being held up for our inspection in this image. Shrilk is made from leftover shrimp shells and proteins derived from silk, hence its name. And we are told it might provide an environmentally friendly alternative to plastic, offering many of the advantages of that material while also being biodegradable. As you can see from this report in The Guardian, more and more reports of these materials are turning up in the national press, on radio, television, etc. Another new material is, I don't know how you pronounce it, sugru, shown here with its inventor, a product design student at the Royal College of Art, who had the idea that she might be able to find a new fix-everything material. In one of her experiments, she combined bathroom sealant with wood dust powder, and that eventually led to the development of a moldable setting silicone rubber that has been compared with blue tack and sellotape in terms of its significance. So the possibilities for the creation of new materials, of new stuff, now seems endless. And going along with all this innovation in the creation of new materials, there's a burgeoning interest in the idea of materiality itself. People are thinking more and more about what there is in the world in terms of materials, objects, and things, and they are giving serious attention to the meanings and the uses of these things in our lives. Suddenly, stuff is all the rage. And indeed, the term itself has become a bit of a buzzword, and stuff is being brought to our attention by all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. And one of the most prominent examples of this is the book Stuff Matters by the material scientist Mark Miodownik. Miodownik has appeared frequently recently in the media, speaking very eloquently about the importance of materials. Miodownik says that what allows us to behave as humans are our clothes, our homes, our cities, our stuff, and that the material world is not just a display of our technology and culture, it is part of us. We invented it, we made it, and in turn, it makes us who we are. In the 10 chapters of his book, Miodownik deals with 10 different materials in turn: steel, paper, concrete, chocolate, etc. And beginning with a personal reflection on each of those materials, he goes on to tell stories about the technological development of those materials, interwoven with stories about how those materials impinge on our lives, what they do for us, how they make our lives better, how they occasionally might harm us, and also how much we often take them for granted. Similar sentiments can be found in the thoughts and writings of those people who study material culture. We can define material culture as all the evidence in the form of things that can be attributed to culture, past and present. And arising out of an interest in those things is the discipline which is known as material culture studies, an interdisciplinary field which investigates the relationships between people and their things in terms of their making, their history, the ways that they have been preserved, the ways that they have been collected, interpreted, displayed, etc. So one of the most prominent people in this field, Daniel Miller, like Mark Miodownik, also talks about stuff, and indeed has written a book of that name, with the central claim, again similar to Miodownik's, that things make us just as much as we make things. And Miller wants us to learn from focusing our attention on stuff. So we can say that things have important stories to tell us. And that was demonstrated in a very accessible but also scholarly way in the series, which you might have heard, A History of the World in 100 Objects, presented by Neil MacGregor and produced by the BBC in partnership with the British Museum in 2010. There's also a contemporary branch of philosophy that focuses on things. And I'm grateful to my colleague, Professor Clive Kazuo, for pointing me in the direction of the philosopher Graham Harman, whose development of object-oriented ontology seems to chime with a more general cultural shift in recent years, away from a focus on language and the idea that language holds the key to knowledge, and towards the idea that it is things that we need to understand better. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an art and craft historian with a particular interest in materials and objects. But my curiosity is very much aroused when Harman says that we should ask to hear more about jugs and artworks, as well as about oceans and diamonds and earthquakes. And I'm intrigued by his proposal to ferret out the specific psychic reality of earthworms, dust, armies, chalk, and stone. I must also mention ecology. A popular understanding of ecology is that it is about nature and the environment. So when we think of ecology, we think about important issues such as the depletion of the world's resources, or the importance of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere, etc. And of course, it's right to focus on that. But the work of ecologists, such as Jane Bennett, reminds us that at its basic level, ecology is about the relationship between things. And much in the way that Graham Harman, as a philosopher, wants to give equal attention to all things. So Bennett wants us to shift our attention away from a human-centric view of the world to what we might call a thing-centered view of the world. So Bennett challenges the idea of matter as passive stuff, as raw, brute, or inert. She reminds us that things, as well as human beings, have a degree of agency. Things act powerfully on one another. And she asks, what dangers do we risk if we continue to overlook the force of things? And she wants greener forms of human culture and more attentive encounters between people materialities and thing materialities. So I brought your attention to new materials, to materials science, to material culture, to the stories of things, the philosophy of things, and ecology. And we mustn't forget art. Certainly during the last decade or so, there has been a shift away from a language-dominated conceptual understanding of art, which held sway for many years, to a renewed interest in objects and materials. So we have moved from what has been called the dematerialization of the art object to the rematerialization of the art object. All of these are examples of a very lively contemporary interest in stuff. So I would ask then, are we in a position to talk about a new academic discipline? Stuff studies. Can we look forward to a time when a professor of stuff at Cardiff Metropolitan University will be standing here telling us all about thing theory? Now, attractive as this prospect might be, I don't actually think this is going to happen. Despite a common interest in stuff, there is a serious fault line running through all this. And it's a fault line that runs through many of our accounts of the world. And it centers on the question of whether human beings are part of the natural world or separate from it. So yes, the argument might go, we should look at what people make. We should look at the objects that contribute to human culture. But don't animals interact with materials and make things too? Orangutans play creatively with clay. Swallows build nests with clay. And a philosopher such as Graham Harman might look at Mark Miodownik's list of chapter headings, beginning steel, paper, concrete, and say, yes, it's good, we should look at these man-made materials, but isn't it just as important to look at non-man-made materials? Materials that were around before people were around, such as dust chalk, stone, and we might add clay. Don't they deserve our attention too? So the background context to this lecture is this cultural shift towards an interest in things, materials, stuff, as a way of understanding the world. And very simply, I am with Daniel Miller when he says that things make people, just as people make things. And of course, the particular thing, the particular stuff that I'm interested in is clay. And I'm asking the question of clay, what kind of stuff do you call that? And one very straightforward answer to that question is that clay is the kind of stuff that makes wonderful objects like these. Even if we just limit a survey of ceramics to my colleagues here in Cardiff, we can see the extraordinary variety of work that can be produced from clay. Work such as that made by Morgan Hall, Claire Kernin, Duncan Aiscoff, Caroline Taylor, Pauline Munkham, Natasha Mayo, Zoe Priest. So let's just remind ourselves that these are the kinds of objects that are collectively described as ceramics. And it is possible to say simply that clay is the stuff that ceramics is made out of. Clay makes things like this. So isn't that the end of the story? Well, not quite. Because the use of clay is not the sole preserve of ceramicists. Other people working within the visual arts, particularly those people we call sculptors, have used clay over many centuries and continue to use clay today. And it is this relationship between ceramics and sculpture, so close to one another and yet so far away, that has engaged much of my attention over the past few years. And as Gaynor said, in 2009, I had the opportunity to spend some time as a visiting research fellow at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, studying this relationship between ceramics and sculpture. I should say here that the Henry Moore Institute, although it is funded by the Henry Moore Foundation, doesn't focus exclusively on the work of Henry Moore. It's an institute for the general study of sculpture in the widest sense of that word. It was a great opportunity for me to go there and use their facilities to research this ceramic sculpture relationship. Next door to the Henry Moore Institute is the Leeds Art Gallery. And the Institute looks after the major collection of sculpture at the gallery. I was given access to the whole collection. And like most big collections of this kind, most of the work is in storage rather than on public display. And as I looked through this sculpture collection, one thing struck me forcibly. Although there were many sculptures that were cast in bronze or made of other materials, such as aluminium, and other materials such as wood and stone were very well represented, there were actually very few pieces in clay. However, I knew that just up the road from Leeds at York Art Gallery, there were major collections of ceramics. It's very interesting for me to discover that these two major centers for sculpture and ceramics, although so close, although seemingly sharing similar interests in three-dimensional visual art, not only had they never had anything to do with one another prior to me going there, they were not even aware of one another's existence. So with wonderful cooperation from both institutions, I was able to bring at least some of the two collections together in an exhibition that was called A Rough Equivalent, Sculpture and Pottery from the Post-War Period. Must admit, I wondered what would happen when the ceramics and sculpture were shown together, and was very pleased to see that the work sat very happily together, and the stylistic resemblances between the two sets of works spoke very much of a common aesthetic rooted in the context of the post-war decades of British art. Shortly after my fellowship in Leeds, I was fortunate to be able to continue research in this area when I was asked by York Art Gallery to contribute a chapter to a book on the ceramicist Gordon Baldwin. Baldwin is happily still alive, and the book on his work that I contributed to was due to be published to accompany a major retrospective of his work in York in 2012. Baldwin's work is interesting because it has always straddled the ceramic-sculpture divide. You can see in these images that the kind of work that Baldwin was producing in clay in the early 1960s was very similar to that produced in metal by British sculptors contemporary to him, such as Kenneth Armitage. While researching Baldwin's work, I came across a very interesting recollection by him of a time in the 1960s when he sent some photographs of his work to a London gallery. The gallery proprietor duly asked him to take some of his work along for the gallery to see. When he got there, Baldwin unpacked the work and was astonished when the gallery proprietor took one look at them and exclaimed, "Oh my God, they are pots," and rejected them as unsuitable for exhibition. And the sense of confusion and insult that Baldwin felt was compounded rather than lessened when the gallery proprietor told him that if he was willing to cast the work in bronze, that would be okay, and the work could be shown. When I think of this sticky situation and the difficult position that Baldwin was put in at that point, it's actually the cartoons of H.M. Bateman that come to mind. Some of you might know of them, although it is a long time ago now that they were drawn. Typically, Bateman's cartoons showed some hapless soul realizing too late that they have committed a dreadful faux pas. So, for example, Bateman gives us the man who drank the banned champagne. I like to think that if Bateman had been aware of the incident with Gordon Baldwin's work, then he might have produced a cartoon on the lines of the man who offered his pots to a London gallery under the mistaken impression that they were art. So to come back to my facetious question, clay, what kind of stuff do you call that? I think it would be someone like that man in the brown cape who would have uttered this question as he sent Gordon Baldwin away from his London gallery. In later life, I'm sure Baldwin saw the preposterousness of the situation and might even have been able to laugh at it. But there's a serious point here that deserves attention. 40 years on from the very real exclusion of Gordon Baldwin's ceramics from the McRoberts and Turner Gallery, art made from clay was still, it seems, a problem. Interviewing Grayson Perry as one of the shortlisted nominees for the 2003 Turner Prize, Stuart Jeffries could still seriously ask, what, say critics down their noses, are ceramics doing in an art gallery? With an aphorism worthy of Oscar Wilde, the soon-to-be Durward Prize winner replied, "If you call your pot art, you're being pretentious. If you call your shark art, you're being bold and philosophical, a reference to Damien Hirst. Brilliant as this reply is, it nevertheless hints at a very stubborn idea that art made from clay should know its place, and its aspiration to art status is not something to be granted lightly. A year after Perry won the Turner Prize, in a catalogue to accompany the exhibition The Secret History of Clay, From Gauguin to Gormley, at Tate, Liverpool, one of the curators, Simon Groom, highlighted the exclusion of works in clay from accounts of modern art. And he said that this hints at an anxiety over the status of the material. Even the title of the exhibition is telling, The Secret History of Clay, as if it's a history that has always been slightly ashamed of itself. We're now 10 years on from the secret history of clay, and although we've come a long way in 10 years, I'm still not sure that the anxiety about clay has entirely disappeared. Partly that anxiety is about the associations that clay has. Of course, I'm well aware that clay is often associated with craft, and it is this association with craft that can account in some way for the exclusion that Simon Groom talks about. It can account in some way for Grayson Perry's comment that sharks are more acceptable as art than pots. It can account in some way for the separation of the collections of sculpture and ceramics in Leeds and York. And indeed, it can account in some way for the very real exclusion from the art world that Gordon Baldwin experienced. Now, I'm not going to pursue that association of clay with craft any further this evening. I certainly acknowledge it, but I don't have time to do it justice. For the rest of my talk, I'm going to stick closely to a discussion of clay. Clay as a basic material for the making of art. I'm also going to stick closely to clay used within the context of sculpture and fine art, rather than ceramics. Looking around, I can see that many of us here, myself included, have an allegiance to ceramics. That is the world that we're comfortable in. But often it's good to leave our comfort zone and cast our gaze a little wider. I know that this is a subject which I'm now sensitized towards, but I can't help spotting examples of the problematic status of clay whenever I find myself in a gallery or a museum. For example, just a few weeks ago, I was in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and I saw these two 17th century busts displayed near to one another. First sight, they're innocuous enough, not much difference between them, you might say. But if you pay a bit of attention, you see that the one on the left is a terracotta, that is, it's modeled from clay, then fired in a kiln, and the label tells us that such portraits were considerably less expensive than sculptures carved in marble, such as the one on the right. The title of the terracotta on the left is Bust of a Man, and the title of the one on the right, made from marble, is Portrait Bust of Peter Spearing, who we are told was a wealthy Delft tapestry weaver. So the bust of the anonymous man on the left is made from a cheap material, namely clay, whereas the bust of the named wealthy man on the right is made from an expensive material, namely marble, suggesting that the relative cost of these materials and their associated status could be of significance. In looking further, one of the things that we can note is that the bust on the left is modeled. That is, it's made out of an additive process, with the artist building up the bust by applying pieces of clay, whereas the bust on the right is made by a subtractive process, so the sculptor starts with a solid block of stone, which is then carved away to reveal the form. Historically, some sculptors have concentrated on one of these processes, and other sculptors have chosen to use both processes. Of course, the choices that sculptors make are based on aesthetic and technical considerations, but we shouldn't overlook the kinds of value judgments that such choices can provoke. And periodically, arguments have arisen about which is best, modeling or carving. On the whole, it has to be said that it is modeling that comes out worst. And this has real implications for the way that we feel about clay. For example, there's Michelangelo's famous comparison between painting, modeling, and carving. And as far as Michelangelo was concerned, although all three activities were theoretically the same, in practice carving was superior because it required more judgment and more physical labor than the others. This modeling-carving argument resurfaced in a particular fierce way in the 1930s in Britain. R.H. Walensky was one of the foremost writers on sculpture at the time, and in his book, The Meaning of Modern Sculpture, Walensky argued that carving was immeasurably superior to modeling. He called on Michelangelo's comments to back up his opinion, but he went further and came down particularly hard on clay, which is, of course, the modeler's primary material. So Walensky thought the clay was suitable only for the rendering of pretty and romantic effects. He might have had a modeler such as Dalou in mind. As a soft material, clay was incapable of offering any kind of resistance to the sculptor, whereas hard materials offered the greatest challenge to the sculptor and the greatest possibilities for grave and austere effects. Walensky might have had a carver such as Henry Moore in mind. In summary, you might say that for Walensky, modeling in clay was a lightweight activity, whereas carving the harder stones was what the real heavy-duty sculptor did. This idea was pushed even further by another interwar writer on sculpture, Stanley Casson, in his book 20th Century Sculptors. Casson also celebrated the virtues of working with hard stone, stressing the technical difficulties that needed to be overcome. And in Casson's judgment, it was this kind of technical difficulty that drives the weaker spirits to the use of clay and plaster. They are frightened by the risks. You can see Claire smiling. Now, I'm afraid there isn't time here to pursue the very strong gender implications of this argument. The arguments that both Walensky and Casson were putting forward, although clearly they are important. Certainly there was the feeling that strength and control were the preeminent qualities that sculptors should demonstrate in their work, and carving gave this opportunity to the sculptor much more than modeling. As well as the issue of gender, there is the historical context to consider here. We need to remember that these authors were writing just a decade or so after the end of the First World War, and it would not be long before a Second World War would threaten the very basis of civilization. The idea that art should play its part in advancing civilization, that it should be high art, intellectually rigorous, even contributing to mankind's evolutionary progress, was a very powerful idea at the time. And the materials and processes that artists used were very much caught up in that debate. The use of weak, soft materials by artists would hardly be likely to move civilization forward in the way that hard, challenging materials would. I want to move on now to look at how some artists in the post-war period used clay. And as a bridge towards that, I'm using these words from Walensky's The Meaning of Modern Sculpture. Walensky says that the modeler begins with nothing beneath his hand. He has an idea and makes an armature, and onto that he sticks a series of lumps and worms and pellets of clay until the idea has been given form. Clay is not a substance with a permanent character. It is mud in the process of becoming dust. Here, Walensky makes no attempt to hide his aversion to clay, and his feeling that clay is not a suitable material for the sculptor is laid bare for us to see. He reduces clay to dust, to mud, to nothingness, to the basest of base materials. Well, in contrast, in the 1950s, for artists such as Asger Jorn in Denmark and Kazuo Scirocco in Japan, the soft, weak, muddy, impermanent qualities that Walensky condemned in clay were precisely the qualities that allowed the kind of immediacy of expression that could never be achieved with hard materials such as stone and metal. So in 1950, we see Asger Jorn on a scooter being pushed through clay, making a panel which would become a mural for a Jutland school. With no concerns for what high art should be, this is literally as well as aesthetically low art. Art brought to the ground, art brought to earth. In 1955, Kazuo Scirocco was photographed wrestling in the mud in a performance that went on for so long that the artist gave up, exhausted, beaten by the clay, so that the earth had won. Kazuo Scirocco belonged to a group of radical young Japanese artists who called themselves the Sadaisha, a name that derives from a traditional ceramic glaze pattern reminiscent of earthworms trailing through mud. As well as Asger Jorn in Denmark, artists such as Lucio Fontana in Italy and Karel Appel in the Netherlands reclaimed clay as an art material, from the bottom up, as it were, starting from the material itself, reveling in its materiality, its playfulness, its anti-art appeal. Clay was a favored medium for many artists caught up in that broad swathe of post-war, materials-led European expressionist art that coalesced under various headings and groups, such as Cobra, primitive art, Tachism, art informel, art brut. This last is particularly interesting. It's often translated as raw art and is primarily associated with the French artist Jean Dubuffet. Dubuffet rejected traditional high art aesthetics in favor of what he thought was a more authentic, more rooted, more basic approach to art and life. Rather than looking towards conventional art and art history, the kind of art you would find in galleries and books, he looked instead at primitive art, at children's art, and at outsider art, including the art of the insane. Dubuffet was interested in art produced by individuals who were, as he said, unscathed by artistic culture. In rejecting conventional art standards, Dubuffet also rejected conventional art materials. So we see that the press release for an exhibition of Dubuffet's work at a gallery in New York in 2001 stated that, freeing himself of the academic rules, Dubuffet experimented with materials such as dirt, clay, grass, and rubbish. This is interesting because although this association of clay with dirt, grass, and rubbish fits quite well with the argument I'm making here, in fact, Dubuffet only rarely used clay and was more likely to use even less conventional materials. So although this piece here has a clay look to it, in fact, it's made of papier-mâché. Perhaps it just goes to show that when commentators want to make a point about artists' use of lowly materials, clay is always there, ready at hand for them to do just that. Perhaps of more importance is the fact that Jean Dubuffet was a link between Asger Jorn, the artist who rode his scooter through the clay, and the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. In the late 1940s, Dubuffet exchanged letters with and subsequently met Lévi-Strauss, who at about the same time that Dubuffet was forming his ideas about art brut or raw art, was thinking along similar lines as an anthropologist. Levi-Strauss was, for example, taking an interest in artifacts produced by prisoners, as well as those produced by indigenous tribes in South America. Both Dubuffet and Levi-Strauss saw value in this raw art, art untouched by the market or by commodification. Dubuffet was also great friends with Asger-Jorn. In fact, one of the few major pieces of work that Dubuffet produced in clay was the ceramic mural at the Asger-Jorn Museum in Denmark. Throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we can see these raw art principles as theorized by Jean Dubuffet and Claude Lévi-Strauss, given shape in Asger-Jorn's work produced in ceramics. It's the kind of work that was described rather disparagingly by Hilton Kramer in 1955 as high unseriousness. It is work that refuses to play the high art game in its choice of subject matter, but also especially in its choice and use of material. Indeed, it could be argued this kind of use of clay has never really gone away. The rawness of clay, its visceral basic quality, seems to have an enduring appeal for artists, as we see in these two examples. Stills from two films, Changes, Performance with Drying Slip by Jim Melchett in 1972, and The Dirt of Love by Roger Hyans, Mark Titchener, and Gary Webb, 2002. And just last year at the Serpentine Sackler Gallery in London, there was an exhibition of the Argentinian artist Adrian Villarrojas. Clay is soil, Villarrojas says. It is refined soil. I've already had a list of words this evening that have been used to describe art made from clay. Words used in a negative way, but also words reclaimed, turned around, re-energized, and worn as badges of honor. Weak, soft, dust, nothing, mud, soil, dirt, raw. And Villarrojas gives us two more to add to the list: fragile and doomed. He says of his work, because the material is too fragile, because the pieces are difficult to transport, because they are cracking, they deteriorate in a totally disproportionate way. I never smash the sculpture to get the cracks, he says. It just happens. And why does it happen? It happens because Villarrojas' work, like the two previous examples we saw, are, of course, literal examples of raw art, in that although the works use clay as a material, the clay is not fired. It remains in its raw state. Now, although I've been talking about clay this evening, what I haven't yet referred to is the fact that clay, if it is to become ceramics, needs to be fired in a kiln. This firing process is of great significance, and yet it so often goes unremarked. Firing is the great unseen yet crucial event that must occur if the raw clay in the artist's studio is to have any kind of permanent life beyond the studio. We can say that through the process of firing, the clay is transformed from a raw state to a cooked state. Some of you may be familiar with this opposition of the raw and the cooked. It was the title of one of the anthropologist Levi-Strauss's most celebrated works. It's also a title of a landmark ceramics exhibition organized by the Museum of Modern Art, Oxford, in 1993. Curators of the exhibition, Alison Britton and Martina Margetts, quoted the words that introduced Levi-Strauss's book as a preface to their catalogue. The aim of this book is to show how empirical categories, such as the categories of the raw and the cooked, the fresh and the decayed, the moistened and the burned, which can only be accurately defined by ethnographic observation, and in each instance by adopting the standpoint of a particular culture, can nonetheless be used as conceptual tools with which to elaborate abstract ideas and combine them in the form of prepositions. I think it was something of a masterstroke on the part of the curators to reuse Levi-Strauss's title and apply it to clay. I'm not sure how much their project was entirely faithful to Levi-Strauss's ideas, and I'm not sure that the exhibition was entirely successful. Nevertheless, I do think that Britten and Margetts were onto something. We can summarize Levi-Strauss's ideas about the raw and the cooked by saying that they refer to a binary opposition between nature and culture, between the savage and the civilized, between that which is instinctive and that which is socialized, between that which is favored and that which is not favored. And part of what makes us human is our need to reconcile those opposites, to act like cooks, making what is raw and unacceptable edible and acceptable. Perhaps this is something of a gross oversimplification rather than a summary of Levi-Strauss's ideas, but there does seem to be a kind of resonance there when that idea is applied to clay. Firstly, we have indeed seen this evening how clay was manifestly out of favor at certain times in the 20th century. Modeling was rejected in favor of carving in the 1930s because clay was weak and soft in comparison to stone, which was hard and resistant. Gordon Baldwin's work was unacceptable to the London Art Gallery because it was made of clay, but it would have been acceptable if it had been cast in bronze. There was even a time when a pot and a shark constituted two opposites, with a shark winning out in the bold and philosophical, acceptable art stakes. Secondly, there is this other very direct way that we can apply the idea of the raw and the cooked to clay, in that clay can exist as a raw material and it can also be transformed into a cooked material. Interestingly, as we've seen this evening, this transformation doesn't have to take place through the actual physical process of cooking or firing. We've seen that artists such as Jim Melchett and Adrian Villa-Rojas will leave their work in an unfired state, with the raw clay being metaphorically rather than literally cooked in the process of it being transformed into art. Indeed, one of the things that I have noticed in my research into sculptors who use clay is the relatively high numbers of them now who are content either to leave their work unfired or to engage on only the most minimal level with the process of firing. I think this contrasts with the continuing fascination on the part of many ceramicists with the kiln and the limitless possibilities of glaze and surface treatment, as we have already seen in the work of my colleagues at Cardiff. So let's return then to my question about clay. What kind of stuff do you call that? Does the anxiety over the status of the material still exist in the way that it did 10 years ago, when Simon Groom and his co-curator Edmund de Waal felt it necessary to organize the exhibition, A Secret History of Clay? Well, things have moved on, partly because that exhibition itself brought attention to works in clay that many people had not been aware of before, and partly because so many artists are now using clay. The return to materiality, to an interest in things and stuff that I identified earlier on, makes for a rich climate in which clay as an art material can flourish. Much of this renewed activity does seem to be centered on the raw rather than the cooked end of the spectrum. It's the dirt, mud, dust, soil associations that are attractive to many artists now when they turn to clay. We're not complaining about this, quite the opposite. But with such a focus on the raw, I think that there is actually a danger that the cooked possibilities of clay might now be underexploited and overlooked. So, to sum up then, my answer to my own question about clay is that clay is the stuff that is unrivaled as an art material. When an artist picks up clay in their studio, they are picking up an extraordinary range of potential transformations and interpretations. Clay has a long history and it has a broad reach, so long and so broad that it is sometimes difficult to hold everything together, and anxiety can sometimes ensue about the limits of practice. In the end, though, the artist who uses clay can wallow in the mud, or they can cook clay to their heart's content. So I would say that that's the kind of stuff that it is, and what else is there that's like it? Thank you.